Hello everybody, welcome to PlayStation Access, where Rosie and I have big, stupid, nerdy grins on our faces because we have both played a huge chunk, 4 hours of Final Fantasy XVI on PS5, and
what an experience, right?
This video is called Why It's the Most Shocking Final Fantasy Game Ever, and I think it's shocking for multiple reasons, Rosie. Like, the first reason I think is, like, it's unlike any Final Fantasy game I've ever played before.
Yeah.
And I know every sort of mainline Final Fantasy game comes along and always looks to reinvent the series. Like, Final Fantasy has never been a series that's been content to stay still. It's always innovating.
Yeah.
It's always trying to push forward and do new things. In terms of like the tone of the story though, and you'll have seen this in the trailers if you've been keeping up with all of the trailers that have come out so far, it's brutal.
It's so brutal.
In terms of, like, you know, we've seen in the trailer, like, Josh covered in blood and...
Yeah, like it just gets splattered across his poor innocent face.
Yeah, I know, he's a child, and it's like...
all over him, and it's like, you just look at his face and, oh my god, I have your face as well, Joshua!
And, well, we're not going to, just to clarify right now, we're not going to reveal any story spoilers whatsoever, so we're not going to reveal any sort of specifics. We're going to have to sort of dance around all of that. But we played that scene where Josh gets his face covered in blood, and the moments leading up to that, and indeed the bit that happens immediately after, was so good. That was my favourite bit of the whole 4-hour chunk that we played. Really sort of epic moment. But I remember just being like, just open mouth.
Literally the whole time, like, my heart was like pounding.
It's not like we've never seen stuff like that in video games before, but for a Final Fantasy game to be doing this, I was like, oh, Final Fantasy!
Yeah.
I can't believe you're doing this.
It's like if you're watching a children's TV show and then suddenly it just does like something completely dark and you're like, what? Like,
yeah, it's Final Fantasy. Again, it's difficult to quantify because Final Fantasy. It's not like Final Fantasy has never been dark before or dealt with complex, dark adult themes, because it absolutely has.
Yeah. Just
the way in which they're presented this time, tonally, it's a lot different to anything that Final Fantasy has done before, and it's really sort of exciting and shocking at the same time to be playing through this game. I think we could talk probably about sort of the artistic influences that they've certainly looked at things like Game of Thrones.
Yes.
We're in like a fantasy setting this time for Final Fantasy XVI, but this is not the twee medieval happy fantasy of a Final Fantasy IX.
Which is what everyone thought at first, didn't they? When it was like, oh, the crystals are back, everyone was like, oh, we're going back to like the original roots with the hero and the crystals.
It's like a really cool mix of that though, isn't it? Because there are like incredible vistas with like mountain-sized chunks of crystal and these amazingly elaborate cities built in the shadow of these like big chunks of crystal. So there's loads of visual motifs that Final Fantasy fans will be familiar with, mixed with, I'd say, a very Game of Thrones inspired grittiness and realness. Like, it's a fantasy that feels grounded in reality a lot more than, say, the fantasy of Final Fantasy IX. And it's exciting and brutal at the same time. Like some of the, again, not going into story specifics, but like the betrayals that happen in the story that you're just not expecting, and they're not sort of like pantomime betrayals. They're really sort of like underhand and subtle and shocking and absolutely have come out of nowhere. And it sort of lends a real sort of tension to every sort of scene, every sort of story scene that you come across. There's like a real underlying sort of tension there. Like the conflicts feel really raw and
I was going to say,
emotional.
Like, not only from the sequences that we've seen of things been more brutal, but like you're saying about the raw emotion, the characters themselves are much more like they're not holding back. If they've got a very strong, passionate emotion, they're screaming. They are like, you can see the plotting, schemingness behind their actions and their voice and everything. You know, if a character fancies another one, then they're not holding back. They're
I was going to mention that.
I won't lie.
There's like There's a little bit of hanky-panky going on in Final Fantasy 16.
A couple of romances that we saw, and it's just like, whoa, calm down, Final Fantasy.
It's not like we're seeing anything that video games haven't done before. Like anyone who's played Mass Effect and Dragon Age, we're like, it's just a romance scene in an RPG. But for Final Fantasy to do it, again, I was like, Final Fantasy?
Yeah.
Final Fantasy!
What's going on here? Final Fantasy.
What are you doing? But it is like a real sort of tonal shift. It feels a lot more mature than any Final Fantasy game I've played, certainly recently. And that sort of tone lends itself to everything else in the game. So like, the setting, the characters, the story, the combat.
Yeah.
All feels grounded by this tone, by this realistic tone, despite the fact that it is set in a fantasy world. And like, having said all of that, when I say Game of Thrones is like a fantasy world with it feels more like a historical world, Game of Thrones, almost, with dragons and ice zombies. Whereas Final Fantasy 16 is definitely a fantasy world. It's just got that sort of that edge, that sort of dangerous. Anything can go wrong at any minute. Any of these characters could betray any of the others. Anyone could die brutally at any minute.
There's like multiple wars going on. You've got the overall war that's happening, but then you've also got, not wars, but like battles between characters themselves and other motives and things like that. So like you're saying, similar to Game of Thrones, when you've got the overall sort of premise, it's the relationship between the characters themselves and the betrayal and stuff. That's what you're really getting gripped on. Oh, well, at least I was anyway. I know there was a moment when they were talking about, the battles and stuff like that, but then as soon as Benedicta came in, and I was just like...
Everyone loves Benedicta.
I was just like, Benedicta, I know that you're plotting something, you're being a scheming little madam right now, and I was just like, what are you scheming? What's happening next and stuff?
I did really still appreciate the but you get these cutscenes between these characters who are plotting and scheming and trying to work out how they're going to deploy their, the icon, the Titan dominant you see in one of these early cutscenes, and they're planning on how most efficiently to deploy him in battle against this invading army.
Yeah.
And he just gets his cigarette, and extinguishes his cigarette in the king's cup of wine.
Yeah.
And then exhales all of the cigarette smoke into his face. And there's passive aggressive, and then there's that.
Yeah.
You get a real sense also of okay, this guy's a bad guy, or this guy doesn't care.
There's a real mixture with the dominances because, so these people who, let's say Titan before, he's not the actual icon when he's just a man, I guess, like the dominants, they're a real mixture of characters. There's some that you can clearly be who we just saw putting out his cigarette in the king's cup and stuff. You're like, wow, you are a bad guy. But then you have, even Sid, for example, you see him and immediately you're like, you've got power, but also you want to change things. And so all the dominants have their own stories, and some of them accept their power rather clearly. Others are like, oh, we don't like how we're being treated and used as items and things like that. So it's really interesting that you've got a whole mix of dominance and how they're gonna how they feel about being a dominant.
I think it reflects the different views of dominance across the multiple realms in Final Fantasy XVI. And in some places they're revered and worshipped almost as gods, whereas in other places in Final Fantasy XVI they're outcasts and shunned, and people are disgusted by the dominance. So you get a real mixture of characters who obviously revel in their godlike ability and the power that they have, and also some that are ashamed of it and afraid of it almost. And I think, I am, it certainly feels like that is going to play a key role in the ongoing story of Final Fantasy XVI. The icons and the dominants feel very important to the story.
100%.
And we should touch upon the fact that, in the latest State of Play gameplay, we saw footage of, I think, Ifrit fighting against Phoenix.
Yes.
And we got to play that fight.
Yes, we did. We got to control Phoenix, fighting off Ifrit, and it was so cool. Ifrit was jumping around all over the place.
It's one of the most lavish, outrageously expensive looking set pieces I've ever seen. And the fact that the gameplay is sort of shifting when you get to control these icon fights. So you've got essentially Phoenix aiming Gatling guns of fire at Ifrit, as Ifrit is like jumping between pillars, smashing through rocks, like trying to absolutely punch Phoenix whilst you're shooting out rays. The whole setup before the fight as well was like so incredibly epic. Like we talk about like a grounded realness and like a Game of Thrones style edge to things, but there is also ridiculously lavish, spectacular fantasy style set pieces where you've got two godlike beings absolutely leathering the snot out of each other.
Well, when we were controlling Phoenix, there was actually a couple of moments I lost where Ifrit was, because I was just looking at like if Phoenix's wings just flying around and all the beautiful, like how beautiful Phoenix just looked. I was like, oh, I'm so pretty. I'm a pretty Phoenix.
It was like visually one of the most insane things I think that I've seen in a video game. And you know, I had to remind myself as I was playing this, it's like, oh, you're controlling this right now. Like, I remember,
this is a fight. This isn't a film or anything.
I remember that. I mean, the summons in Final Fantasy have always been like a jaw drop moment. I remember when I first played Final Fantasy VII, and you first summon Ramuh, I think is the first summon you get. Or like, you know, actually it's the Chocobo, isn't it? You get the Chocobo. But, you know, I remember first summoning Bahamut as well, and just like my eyes bulging like, oh my God, I can't believe how cool this looks. Like if I could show 11-year-old me what the icons in Final Fantasy XVI look like, how ridiculously massive they are in scale. I mean, you know, again, I don't want to sort of reveal anything, but like the very first thing you do in the game with Clive is sort of like run through the middle of this battlefield. And when I was doing it, I was thinking, this is like God of War Ragnarok levels of scale and spectacle here.
Oh, it was fantastic when literally you'll run down, the camera sort of pans up and you see like the
fight
going on
in the sky and just in the background, and there's two armies clashing at the same time as well. You're running through this area and the whole area is like breaking up and splintering apart and exploding all around you.
And you feel it as well.
You feel it. There's
in the
magic flinging off all over the place. The music is going. The music is flipping amazing.
Oh, it's so good. I love the music so much.
Yeah, and it's such a ride. It's such a spectacle.
Yeah.
And the opening of the game, it doesn't pull any punches visually, narratively, tonally. Like it's like, okay, it's very much welcome. It's very quite. There's a lot of stuff that happens that's quite symbolic, I think. And I'm not going to reveal anything specific, but you'll know it when you see it. It's basically like, here's this thing you like, bang! It's gone now! Welcome to Final Fantasy XVI. It's very much like, this is not the Final Fantasy you know.
How do you feel now?
What do you think about this? Be prepared. But I was open-mouthed for the majority of the 4 hours that we had with the game.
Oh, 100%. I was the exact same.
Yeah.
They do have like some fun little, like, you know, it's not all incredibly serious. I want to say when we encountered some goblins, and I just like they after all the seriousness that we just had from what we played, seeing these little goblins, which yes, you have to fight, but they're fully like wah, 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 like with these little voices. I was just I genuinely love them. So there are also like
I knew you would love like horrible snarling little monsters, and you love them.
Yes, because they just popped up and they were just so like just little gremlins, and just I think it was their voices that just got to me compared. I think it was just, you know, with how tonally everything was so serious. That when they just popped up, I was just like, oh my God, okay, here we are, back into some fun little Final Fantasy times. It was just a really nice little, like, just a happy little sound of a gremlin or goblin being like, wah.
And we should probably, and that I think leads us nicely into the combat, Rosie.
Yes.
This was the second time you'd played Final Fantasy XVI, so I'm keen to get your thoughts on this, because the first time you played it, you had... so the combat is real-time, fully real-time in Final Fantasy XVI. The combat director previously has worked on Devil May Cry to give you some sort of idea of the combat that you're going to be experiencing in Final Fantasy XVI. But there are items that you can equip if you're like more of a traditional turn-based role player and you don't want to engage fully in the real-time action of it, which I think you did equip when you first played it, but you didn't this time. So I'm keen to sort of get your thoughts on how that felt.
Yeah, so when we first played it, we were recommended to equip the rings just so we could get a feel for how they all worked and stuff. And I'm glad they did, because now doing this run that we played recently and not having any rings, I could really feel the difference between the two fighting styles. Playing it without any of the rings, I definitely when I played it before, I had mainly the ring for Torgal's actions being automatic. And now having that ring not equipped, I had to really consider, navigating through my menus. It kind of added another extra layer of tension. And with like Devil May Cry 5 combat, it's very much like slashy, but it did then add in the more sort of turn-based, okay, Torgal, go to your menu quick, you attack when the enemy's staggered and stuff. So that kind of did bring me back to, like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where you have to manage multiple people's combats. So that felt like refreshing, but also just added that bit more pressure to the fight. Knowing that you have control of Torgal as well. And the other ring I mainly had on last time was the one where when you dodge, sometimes it helps you a little bit. So if you've missed one, then you can just get a little prompt and just to slow down time and help you out. I got slapped a lot more this time.
I got slapped about a lot. I didn't equip any of the rings. I was like, I'm going to try full combat experience. And I think it's really cool that they do have the rings available if you don't want to be worried about timing your dodges perfectly or any of that kind of stuff. You still get to engage in all of the vast array of moves, both sword-based and magical, that Clive has access to. It's still like going to be satisfying and challenging combat, I think, even with the rings equipped. But without them, you really are tested. Like if you're an action gamer, you're going to have your reflexes tested a lot. I think it's certainly one of those combat systems that probably when you get really, really good at it and get a real feel for it, it's going to feel amazing.
Well, that's
and
the thing. When
absolutely spectacular to really chain together all of Clive's moveset.
Like, as we were playing it more and I was warming up to the combat more, I was getting slapped around less, and it felt so satisfying when you did time those dodges perfectly, and then Clive goes, not this time, and then does the attack, and every time he did that, I was like, yeah, that was me. I did that epic dodge. So that's the thing, mastering, well, obviously we're not masters, we've only played a little bit of it, but getting to grips with the combat with and without the rings is just so satisfying and beautiful. And when I played it without the rings, I felt as if I was fully in control of my actions, controlling the battle, how things were going and stuff. So, it's really good playing it with the rings, but also really good playing it without the rings.
I think. And there was a bit towards the end of our 4-hour hands-on where I felt like I'd gained a level of competence with the combat that made me really confident going into fights with little low-level enemies. We were in this forest area.
Yes.
And there were like plants, like, classic Final Fantasy. Little evil plants and wolves around the place that didn't like the fire magic I had. And like going in with initial blast of fire magic, then a few well-timed sword slashes to fling the enemy on the floor. And when an enemy's on the floor, you can go up to them and hit attack, and Clive will do like a really cool contextual finishing move on them, which feels amazing. Like going in with a fire spell, slash, jump, finisher. And your moveset is augmented by powers you can get from icons. So initially, you've got like fire elemental powers with Clive, and you can choose which ones you equip on like a hotkey system, so you can assign them to like the PlayStation, the face buttons on the DualSense. And when you use them, they have like a cooldown on them, so your typical strategy, role-playing, combat type stuff. But it was when I got a real feel for when I should be using what moves and when, the combat was like immensely satisfying.
Oh, especially when you consider the stagger bar as well. Like what I did is, if I was so close to the stagger bar, I was like, okay, I can hold out for a bit longer, just keep on attacking for now. And then as soon as they were staggered, that's when my icon abilities came out, and it was so satisfying.
100%. Like the quick dodging into an enemy and then attacking thing, I really liked as well. But as you say, the staggering, immensely satisfying, especially against a boss. When the boss comes in and you manage to do a perfectly timed dodge. If you do a perfectly timed dodge, there is like a window of opportunity for you to do like a counter attack. And if you time that quickly, the stagger bar goes, it absolutely flies. So the combat system really encourages you to be brave and to try and get those perfect dodges, try and get those perfect parries. When you pull it off and you manage to stagger a boss and then can absolutely go wailing in on them with like iconic powers, it feels really, really
seeing
brilliant.
all the numbers just like going up with like ×2, ×3, and you're there just like, you know, slashing away, fire upwards and stuff. It's so satisfying.
It really,
visually
really
beautiful, seeing all that explosive action happening in just one spot immediately.
100%. And then, so like we've talked about sort of like the iconic abilities you can have. We got to play a little section of the game with a higher level Clive towards the end of our hands-on session that was in a really beautiful area, sort of like quite a wide open area that we were able to just go and explore and have a fight against some of the monsters that were around there. And that stage we had another icon's abilities as well that you could swap between, like on the fly. So we had, I think it was Garuda's wind-based abilities.
Yes.
And one of Garuda's abilities was like the classic sort of grapple. Had like almost like a grapple ability where you could pull enemies towards you or pull Clive towards other enemies. And I only got a brief little taste of it because it was towards the end of our session, but doing some of those moves and then immediately transitioning back to the fire icon abilities and unloading fire, it just made me think, oh my God, like towards the end of this game when you have multiple different sets of icon abilities, building out your character with the moves you like and use the most and creating your own bespoke combos. So you could do like one of Garuda's moves, switch to one of Ifrit's moves, switch to one of Ramuh's moves or whoever it's going to be. Like it feels like everyone is going to have a Clive that operates in battle in a very distinctive, unique way.
Well, they've all got their advantages as well. Like Garuda has one special ability where it launches enemies like into the sky, and then you do an attack in the sky. So if you've got an enemy that's very grounded, it's not going to do that much effect on them. Even though it looks really cool, they're just going to be chilling on the floor and you're slashing in the air. So it's going to be really fun and interesting, like, to plan out all these moves, so when the right time comes, then you're like, boom, I've got this covered. I know what I'm doing. Garuda, here we go. So it's going to be, it's really good.
It looks spectacular. It really does. And so some of the boss fights, or not even like boss fights, but like mini bosses, there's quite a lot as well. Again, I was reminded of God of War Ragnarok a lot. You're going through and you'll be fighting like, you know, a few rounds of small fry, and then immediately it won't be like a massive boss that will drop a considerable enemy at you and okay, fight this. And there's always a little bit of emotional charge to these moments as well. You're never really fighting something that's just like a throwaway character. There's always like a little bit of, okay, now you're fighting this person, now you're fighting this guy, and it's exciting all the time whenever these encounters are happening. And it is challenging. Like, I wasn't able to just, you know, breeze through it. You have to be really on your toes. And that, combined with how the story feels in terms of the tension of the story and how brutal the story is, like, lends the whole package like this sense of like danger at all times. It's, you know, it's a really sort of thrilling game to play.
There are also cooldown moments as well.
I was
like
say,
I should emphasize
the intro is like, okay, come on, let's go. Welcome to the world of Final Fantasy XVI. There is like, you know,
Like I did a side quest where...
Side quests.
Yeah, yes. I did like a lovely little side quest where you're just exploring this area that Sid's led you to, and someone just needed help serving some plates at a bar. And literally, Clive, so I was there as Clive, and I was just like serving plates to people and then learning about the story of the area that they're living in and their backstories and stuff. So that was a really nice cool down like moment after all the intense action and drama. It was like, I'm just serving plates, talking to people. I helped someone get some wood. So I was just like, here we go. This is the nice cool down section.
See, I didn't do any of the side quests, Rosie. I was like, I was just like, right, I got to go. I wanted to make sure I did everything that we could in the time that we had. So I was very much like, okay, next story bit. When I actually get hold of the full game, I will, of course, do my usual thing of slowing right down.
I couldn't help
fully
myself.
Exploring everywhere, talking to everybody. The world just, it feels so rich already just from that opening 4 hours that we played. So yeah, I'm like, I can't wait to fully dig into it.
And also puppy Torgal. We saw Torgal as a puppy.
Torgal.
And I love Torgal very, 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 very much.
Everyone loves Torgal.
I love Torgal very much.
So Torgal, if you don't know, is a cute little dog who turns out to be a cute large dog,
a badass dog
who aids you. He's like a canine companion who aids you in battle. And as you alluded to earlier, Rosie, you can command Torgal if you like. He's got his own little command window in the bottom left, or you can equip a ring and the game will just take over Torgal for you. So you don't have to worry about issuing Torgal commands. He will just fight by himself. So you've got that choice, which is nice.
But I just want to say I love him very much.
Everyone is going to love Torgal. Torgal's going to be like a social media sensation, I think.
Yes.
When
and I'm going to join in on
launches.
that ride. I'm going to be when everyone's talking about Torgal, I'm going to be like, yes, I love him as well. Let me join your little fan club for Torgal.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, but yeah, overall, it was just, I was struck a lot by how brutal everything was.
Yeah.
And just how visually spectacular the game was, and
it's a beautiful looking game.
I can't wait, Rosie.
Even when we went through the forest area, I was walking through and I was like, oh, this is a lovely forest. I was like, look at this forest.
Yeah.
I've been like, oh, it was so lovely and beautiful. Loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you've enjoyed Rosie and I geeking out about Final Fantasy XVI. We are going to have lots more Final Fantasy XVI on the channel in the lead up to and probably after release as well. It's a massively exciting game. Please let us know in the comments if you've enjoyed this video and if you're looking forward to it and if you're going to be picking it up on day one. And please subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. And also don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our videos from the world of PlayStation. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon.
PlayStation